In the world of comic book storytelling, some tales are so massively important they require being told outside of their normal ongoing titles. Whether revolving around a single character, a team of heroes, or encompassing the fate of the universe, these stories are as important as the rest of the books that come out monthly. The following is no exception. Bridging the gap between comics and audio entertainment media, my Big Fat Poll List is proud to present a podcast mini-series.
You've heard of the Avengers, the Justice League, the X-Men, Teen Titans, Guardians of the Galaxy, Defenders, the Legion of Superheroes, even the Watchmen. But what if we told you that there was another team of colorfully clad heroes that you've never heard of who are equally as influential to comic books and the industry as a whole? Who is this mystery team, you ask? Archie Comics' very own stable of masked heroes, the Mighty Crusaders. During this 5-episode podcast miniseries, we will break down the complete history of these unsung heroes from their beginnings in the late 1930s with MLJ Comics, through their formative years at Archie and Red Circle, to their current incarnations at Dark Circle Comics, and dive into the impact they have had on the world of comics. Welcome to part 1 of our series, where we will discuss the beginnings of these characters, take an in-depth look at their first 10 years in comics, and celebrate the 80th anniversary of some of the greatest heroes you've likely never heard of, as we go all the way with MLJ. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first episode of My Big Fat Pull List's first miniseries event.
Yes.
5-episode series diving into the history of the Mighty Crusaders. I am Dr. Impact, and I will be your host. I will be joined by different hosts in each episode, but for this episode, I am joined by 2 guests. Across the table from me is...
the mysterious Mr. X.
And sitting directly to my right is...
the lovable Smurfy.
Welcome, guys. Thank you for letting me take over the show for a few episodes. I know you guys initially brought me on the show to talk mostly about DC.
Right.
And bring the DC Comics perspective to everything. I have been obsessed with these Mighty Crusaders characters for 30-plus years, and I was dying to do a series of episodes on them. So this is really exciting for me to finally be able to do this.
Well, this is also part of the whole contract we have when we hired you on to the show. If we give you a platform to talk about these characters that not a lot of people have heard of, you're going to give us all the great DC
That's right.
juice that we do not have. So
That's right.
I find it a good trade.
He's holding a gun to my head. That's why I'm here.
No, he's not, Smurf. Don't.
It's-
Yes, he is. It's horrible.
It's a rhetorical gun. Whatever.
It's a
Is that-
rhetorical
yeah.
gun.
A rhetorical gun?
That's not the
Yeah,
right word
never
at
mind.
all.
Yeah, it's not the right word at all.
Not the
But
right word at all.
All
But
right.
moving
Smurfy
on, though.
is a wordsmith, so yeah.
Well, before we get into too much, I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that are wondering, who are the Mighty Crusaders? What is MLJ? What is this thing?
And why are we going all the way with them?
All the way with MLJ.
All the way with MLJ. That a little dirty, actually.
Well, we'll get into more details in a little bit, but basically MLJ Comics was what Archie Comics was known as before they changed their name to Archie Comics.
Okay.
Much like you've heard the phrase, make mine Marvel.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah.
Everyone knows that
Right.
phrase. Well, much like that, MLJ had their own phrase back in the 40s, and it was all the way with MLJ.
Oh, okay.
Now, back then, the vernacular in the 40s, all the way with MLJ, meant something very different. Nowadays, we hear that, and yeah, it does. It sounds...
Thinking about taking my wife in the backseat of a car.
yeah, right.
The 40s were a real wholesome time for us all.
Well, at least superficially, I guess.
Right.
Until that damn McCarthyism came around.
That's right. Which actually did affect comics, but we're not going to get into all that.
That's a different podcast.
That's a wholly different episode. Anybody that's wondering, the Mighty Crusaders were a bunch of superheroes that debuted in the late 30s and 40s. They were very, very popular at the time. when superhero comics kind of made a comeback after the Comics Code incident of the early 50s,
yes.
they never quite caught on the way that the stable of Marvel and DC characters did. These characters have been relaunched every 10 years or so. And they only last for maybe 2 or 3 years in publishing, and then the line gets canceled for whatever reason. They fade away, they disappear, and then they're gone for another 10 years until they get relaunched again.
Honestly, because they sound made up at first.
Yeah.
Like, when you first brought it up to me, I thought it was something that you yourself created.
Oh,
I thought this was your brainchild. Like, hey, I'm going to talk about something I created. I'm like, oh, okay, that'll be kind of cool. Then I was like, oh, these were a real thing.
Yeah.
No idea.
Well, and part of it is because these relaunches that happen every few years don't really last past maybe issue 15 or 20. I mean, I think the run in the 40s is the run that lasted the longest, and then there was a run in the 60s and the 90s that both lasted pretty long, but we'll get to those in future episodes of this miniseries. So basically, these are very classic characters who have been around as long as Marvel and DC, but just have not gotten their due. I guess I should also mention, before we get into this, how I discovered these characters. Because like you said, Smurfy, nobody knows who these guys are, or a very select audience knows who they are. I was about 10 or 11 years old, and so it was early 90s, and like 91, I want to say, somewhere around there. My dad would always buy me comics, random issues of things. He never got me into collecting anything monthly. I read his Crisis, I read a lot of DC stuff, but it was all just whatever he bought for himself. And I remember one day him coming to me and saying, hey, it looks like the Mighty Crusaders are coming back. And I think my response was, who? So he had to explain it to me, and I was like, okay, I mean, I guess if they're going to start a whole new comic book company, I'll jump in, because I'm 10, 11, 12 years old. I don't know the last, at that time, 30, 40 years of history for the two big companies. And I thought, well, this is a way for me to follow a whole comic universe from the ground floor up. And I remember he bought me the first issues of a couple of the Impact comics, the Impact launch in the 90s. And I think it was the Shield, the Legend of the Shield, and the Fly, and I think the Jaguar were the three. And I don't know what it was about them. I fell in love with them, and I started collecting them monthly. And I loved them. Over the years, I've done research on them and found out their rich history, and I've since gone back, and I think I have almost everything now from 1962 to current of these characters.
Okay.
I think, other than maybe a couple of things here or there. That's kind of where I discovered them, was through the Impact line in the 90s. Now, Smurfy, I know that you said you'd never heard of them, right?
At all.
Thought they were made up.
I did.
So this is your first exposure.
Yes.
Well, we enjoy exposing you to things.
I know. I will be traumatized for life.
Hopefully not. Now, for me...
I would say, Mr. X, when...
well, it was you. You're to blame. You exposed...
I do tend to
characters.
Do that.
Yes.
I do tend to expose.
These characters were exposed to me when Dr. Impact and I were actually living together in our early 20s. And he had this wacky idea about wanting to pitch a relaunch of the Mighty Crusaders to Archie Comics, because at the time, there was nothing for those characters at all. And I'm like, who?
Yeah.
By this point in time, I'm neck deep in Marvel history, specifically X-Men. I know almost all there is to know at that time about the Ninja Turtles, and I'm wiggling my toes into DC history. I was pretty current, but I didn't really know the rich history of DC.
I was just say, I think it was at that time you read Crisis, too.
I read Crisis for the first time,
Crisis,
too, yeah. And he says, well, you know what, the easiest way to do this is if you read the Impact stuff. It's the most current. So it was the early 90s. And I'm like, all right, well, you had me at 90s comics, because 90s comics had a style to them. Everything was big. Everything was over the top. And these books were exactly that. They reminded me very much of the style of what Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld were doing for Marvel at that same point in time when those books were coming out. I did my research by reading the Impact stuff, and then, of course, just grilling him about, well, so what's the deal with these characters before all this? Because this seems like a brand new universe. And because I was going to help Dr. Impact in our civilian guises, we were going to be responsible for sending in a pitch to get these characters picked back up from Archie. So we had to know what we were talking about. And at that time, you knew a little bit, not as much as you know now.
Right.
But from what you told me and what you shared with me, I started understanding that these characters represented a time in history that we really don't go back to that often anymore in comic books. I'm looking forward to these 5 episodes so that I can learn even more about the Mighty Crusader characters.
I love these characters so much that I am very excited to share them with you guys, and hopefully it sparks something either in either of you or any of our other guests or anyone out there listening that doesn't know who they are to hunt them down, any of the incarnations of them over the years. Incidentally, I don't know, Mr. X, if I ever told you that was actually the second proposal I sent off.
Really?
To Archie
The
Comics. To relaunch
I
these.
wasn't your
Yes.
first.
You weren't my first. Sorry, my brother and I had done one a few years prior. We were very politely declined by Archie. They were very nice. They sent a rejection letter and everything, but they were very nice. Yeah, which you don't get from a lot of other publishers.
Right.
And then the one that you and I did was like almost 15 years ago, I think now, 20 years ago, something like that.
Almost.
Incidentally, I am now currently working on another relaunch proposal to send to Archie that I've sort of wrapped Mr. X into doing, but we'll get to that in episode 5 when we start talking about the future. A brief history of MLJ. So guys, in order to really kind of get into this, there is a little bit of historical reference, and we don't want to go into a whole lot of it because, again, that is a whole nother podcast for another day. I think it is important to note that this was the mid to late 30s. We were coming in at the end now of the Depression, coming out or starting to come out of the Depression in a bit. Comic books were a very standard form of entertainment for everyone at that time. In March of 1937, of course, as everyone knows, we got issue 1 of the Detective Comics.
Yep.
Which, of course, changes everything. And then a little over a year later, in June of 1938, we get Action Comics #1.
And then changes things again.
Changes things again, and probably the single biggest change in comic history, I would say. But with the debut of Superman and then the following year with Batman in Detective 27, comic book publishers, magazine publishers in particular, started going crazy trying to publish any kind of adventure hero stuff that they could get their hands on, any kind of property that artists would come along and offer. One such company was a company called Independent News. Now, Independent News was primarily a magazine company.
Okay.
And primarily a distribution company at that. But it was the distribution company that distributed what is now known as DC Comics.
Oh, okay.
And that was run by a man named Paul Sampliner. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm not sure. He ran Independent News, and there were a couple of guys that worked for him by the names of Maurice Coyne, Louis Silbercleat, again, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not, and John Goldwater.
Okay.
And some of the, these guys, of course, like any industry, any, little area, they all kind of knew each other. They all kind of interacted with one another. And I want to say that Lewis and maybe John worked for Martin Goodman over at Timely Comics. Martin Goodman was one of the founders of Timely Comics, which would later change their name to Marvel. Anyway, these three guys, Maurice, Lewis, and John, they all met there. And they decided they were going to start doing their own publishing. And if you listen to that, Maurice, Lewis, and John.
Okay. MLJ.
There it is. They formed MLJ Publishing. And the very first book that they released in November of 1939 was a book called Blue Ribbon Comics, #1. That is the first MLJ comic.
Okay.
Which then means that is technically the first Archie comic. because
MLJ would then
eventually
become
become
Archie
Archie.
Comics.
Right. Blue Ribbon Comics, like a lot of other comics at the time, didn't feature any superheroes. In fact, I think the cover feature story was a character called Rangatang the Wonder Dog, which is basically
that doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, it was basically a ripoff of Rin Tin Tin. They probably wanted Rin Tin Tin and couldn't get the rights or the license for Rin Tin Tin. And of course, comics back then were 60, sometimes 80 pages, and you got how many different stories, and each story was 5 to 10 pages long.
Right.
These were big comics, and usually filled with detective stories or crime stories or westerns or whatever, what have you.
Because back then, big comic books like that were like anthologies.
They were all almost all anthology. I think even Action Comics was anthologies. It's just Superman always ended up being the focal story. MLJ gets into the superhero game the following month with Blue Ribbon Comics #2. And then I don't want to... Saying superhero game is probably inaccurate. They get into the masked crime fighter game.
Okay.
Their first masked crime fighter in Blue Ribbon #2 is a character by the name of Bob Phantom.
I absolutely love the name. Bob Phantom. What does he do? I don't care. His name is Bob Phantom.
Well, I can tell you what he does. I've always known about Bob Phantom. I've always known his deal. I've never actually read the first appearance of Bob Phantom until this last week, getting ready for this very podcast.
Oh, okay.
I finally was able to find a copy, and we'll go into that later on in this episode of how to read this stuff. But I was finally able to read it. He's actually really, really cool.
Yeah, okay.
He teleports, which is very interesting for 1939. And
organically, or has a device?
No, well, I don't know. It doesn't go into that much detail.
Oh.
At least not in this story. Now, it might later, but not in this story. And it also appears from the comic that he somehow causes this fog or gas to pop up around him, and then he vanishes within that. Now, whether or not he's causing that with a device or has any kind of abilities or what, I don't know. I've never been able to read far enough to find out, but... Yeah, he's the first.
Okay.
He was a reporter, because everybody in the 40s.
Of course.
Yeah, they're all reporters.
If you were going to be a
That's the dream
crime
job.
fighter, you were either extremely rich or a reporter.
Yeah.
Or a cop who was
or a
wronged.
cop, right.
Yeah.
One of the three. So yeah, he was a reporter by the name of Walter Whitney. He becomes Bob Phantom. Like I said, I've never read his origin. I don't know. There a lot of times in those 40s comics, characters would just appear for 2 or 3 issues, and they never told you why they were wearing a costume. It was just, beware this guy in a mask. So I'm not exactly sure why Walter Whitney, the reporter, decided to dress up and fight crime. I do know that initially he was supposed to be called the Phantom.
Oh.
From what I understand, there is another character known as the Phantom.
Yes.
The ghost who walks, the very famous Phantom. Well, from what I understand, they threatened to sue if MLJ went forward with the Phantom.
Kind of copyright to have the same name, 2 different characters.
Yeah, at the same time. So to differentiate,
you toss on Bob.
Apparently there was an old Bob Phantom character years before in another book, so they stole that name and used that, and no one complained about that one, I guess. I wonder why.
What about Bob?
Yeah. What about Bob Phantom?
Well, couldn't it have just been Bob the Phantom?
It could have been Bob the Phantom. I don't know. Why didn't they just come up with a different
name?
A different name.
That's
Well, you know what? Had they come up with a different name, we would not be spending this much time talking about Bob Phantom.
In all fairness,
that's true.
There wasn't any name generators out there like there are nowadays. You can hop on Google and be like, oh, we got one, we're good to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, back then they had to be creative.
On their own, I know.
Yeah,
there's a picture.
I did bring some visual references for Mr. X and Smurfy here, so you may hear us saying, "Oh, this looks like this." We'll try to describe those to you guys as we go.
Bob might make the website.
Bob,
maybe a whole spread just on Bob.
Just on Bob Phantom, huh?
I love Bob Phantom.
Yeah,
I can't get into why I love Bob Phantom during this episode, but maybe in a future episode I will.
Yeah, Mr. X is a big fan of Bob Phantom. And we'll also include links and images of all of this stuff on our website as well at mybigfatpulllist.com. So be sure to check that out, too. So anyway, Bob Phantom is the first. He starts the MLJ line off. But it's later that month, in December of 39, when MLJ debuts a book called Top Notch Comics, #1. Top Notch Comics was one of their biggest hits. It was one of their bigger titles. And the book premiered with their cover character, the Wizard, the man with the super brain. That's what he was known as. Now, I think in the first 5 or 6 issues of Top Notch, he basically was like Mandrake the Magician. He wore top hat and tails and, and I think a little domino mask. I think around issue 9, I want to say, somewhere around there, of Top Notch, they decided to give him an actual costume, which was a blue leotard jumpsuit and cape to tie him in more with the other superheroes. Yeah, he's basically a Mandrake the Magician, or a Zatara the Magician type of character. He just has a super brain, apparently.
So he does magic and is super smart.
Yeah, and is super smart and has a photographic memory. That is Blaine Whitney is the Wizard. Now, I don't know if they ever intended him and Walter Whitney to have any kind of relation.
Right.
Or if it was just coincidence that Bob Phantom and the Wizard had the same last name. I don't know. According to the Wizard story, Blaine Whitney, his ancestors were heavily involved in many historical moments throughout America's history.
Okay.
And they all had the same photographic superior brain almost that he has. So that's your first superhero at MLJ, is the Wizard.
So we have the masked crime fighter in Bob Phantom over in Blue Ribbon Comics. And then with Top Notch, we've got the actual first superhero in the Wizard. But you know what? For me, Bob Phantom, since it's not explained how he can teleport and where that smoke comes from, I'm going to elevate him, at least in my mind. I will elevate Golden Age Bob Phantom from masked crime fighter to pretty super.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even if it's tech-based, that's still...
Right.
I mean, Iron Man is tech-based, and he's still considered a superhero.
Exactly.
So anyway, that's your start off, but it's January of 1940 when MLJ actually gets to make history. Most people don't know this. Pep Comics #1 is released in January of 1940.
Okay.
And its feature character is the Shield. And the Shield is your basic, run-of-the-mill, patriotic, red, white, and blue superhero.
Okay.
The difference is that he predates Captain America by, I want to say, about 1.5 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Not just that, but he is the very first patriotic superhero of all time in comics, ever.
And people don't know this.
And people don't know this. All other red, white, and blue characters are essentially copies of the Shield. His story is actually very similar to Captain America's in a sense. He and his father are working on this chemical potion of sorts, and his father is killed by terrorists from who knows where. They never actually used real country names in these early Pep comics, these early Shield books. It was always the Sokians. I don't know who the hell the Sokians are or where they come from, or the Musconians, I guess trying to be politically correct.
From the hills of Musco.
1939. Yeah, I don't know, yeah. They're working on this formula, and his father is killed by one of these terrorist cells. And so he decides to devote the rest of his life to chemistry and figuring out this chemical base. Eventually, he does discover the formula for the Shield Serum, and it is an acronym, very much like Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It is Sacrum, Heart, Innervation, Eyes, Lungs, Derma, Shield.
Rolls off the tongue.
Rolls
Yeah.
right, yeah,
Rolls right
exactly.
off the tongue.
It's yeah.
I feel like I understand exactly what this serum does.
Yeah, you can tell why years later they just kind of never mentioned that again. That
Just a
just kinda,
super soldier serum, that's all.
that just kind of went away. It was a serum that would activate those parts of your body. It sounds to me like someone said, "Hey, S.H.I.E.L.D. is a great name. How can we make an acronym out of that?" And that's evidently what they came up with. But yeah, he bathes himself in this fluorescent ray while wearing this metallic suit, and that's how he ends up getting the powers. And the suit kind of augments him. So it's a little bit Captain America, but it's a little bit Iron Man too, if you think about it, because it is the suit really, that gets augmented. He just, I guess he has to increase his body to accept the suit.
Okay.
He was the first, but he's not the only superhero in that book. The other character that appears in Pep Comics #1 is one of my favorite characters, the Comet.
Oh, okay.
The Comet goes all the way back then. I know, Mr. X, you probably remember some of the Comet from the Impact stuff, but this was a very different Comet.
Yes.
Back during the MLJ. This guy was kind of a loose cannon and kind of wild. He would wear this kind of red and blue suit, and the blue portion on his top, the shirt, was covered in stars and moons, and it, looked like a mobile over a kid's crib or something.
Very similar to some of the Captain Marvel.
It is very similar to the Marvel stuff.
Marvel
Yeah, it
stuff.
does, yeah.
I'm sitting over here looking at all these, and it's astonishing. You can see the inspiration in modern-day characters from these, almost like where they got bits and pieces from. His suit looks very similar to Booster Gold with the pattern of, like, Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
And I don't know for certain, but I want to say that he's probably the first comic book superhero to wear a visor, a Cyclops of the X-Men style visor. I don't know that anyone ever did that before the Comet.
And it actually shot
And it actually
lasers out.
Yeah, his deal was that he was a chemist, a scientist, because, they all
were.
You're a
If
chemist
you
and a
could-
reporter.
Not
If you could
not
be a
journalist.
reporter, get into chemistry, kids.
Yep.
Yeah, right. And he discovers this gas from, I guess, a meteorite, I think it is, that he starts to experiment with, and his body absorbs this gas in an explosion, and he ends up becoming powered off of this.
Space gas.
Space gas, right. But
Space farts.
this gas, space farts, is that what you said?
Space farts.
This gas accumulates in his eyes, which causes him to emit a ray of concussion blasts of some sort from his eyes, much
okay.
like Cyclops does. For whatever reason, he instinctively knows that he'd better grab a piece of glass and hold it up to his face. That way the beams don't go all over the place. So, again, much like Cyclops, he has to wear this protective visor to prevent it, and he has a button on the side that he can move the visor up and down to release. So, I mean, it's the Cyclops visor, but in 1939.
Well.
Dun, dun, dun.
These are two of probably the 5 biggest Mighty Crusaders, and we'll hit 3 of them in this episode and 2 more in future episodes. But these are 2 of the most famous and most well-loved, and these are 2 that constantly get relaunched over and over again.
Yeah.
Is the Shield, Mr. Joe Higgins, and the Comet, who is Mr. John Dickering. After that, of course, then Marvel Comics was running, and Action Comics and Detective Comics were both showcasing heroes, and I think by then Superman probably had his own book, and superheroes started exploding.
Yeah.
At that time. MLJ followed suit. There are a lot of other characters that showed up. Obviously, we're not going to have time to cover all of them the way we've covered these characters. But we will put links on the website in the show notes to various websites that you can check out and get all this info on. And we'll get into more of that later in the episode, too. But there were other characters like Steel Sterling, who was kind of an impenetrable Superman-like strong man.
Okay.
And the Fox, who is a very popular one, who is basically just a wronged reporter, I want to say. I think he was a wronged reporter or
Not a
photographer. No, he was a photographer. I'm sorry. He was a
wronged photographer.
He was a wronged photographer, and he becomes the Fox to try and get on the scene, and he's basically clad all in black with a fox emblem on his chest. He's a very neat-looking character, but his stories are very cheesy. They're very, very silly. So yeah, there's the Fox, there's the Firefly, there's a lot of different characters that show up. Inferno is a very, very cool character who is fire-based and actually started out as a villain for Steel Sterling in an early Steel Sterling issue at Zip Comics, and then graduated to his own stories as a hero.
Oh.
So the Inferno kind of played both sides of the fence there. There are 3 other major characters from this era, though, that I feel really need to be addressed when you're talking about the history of MLJ and you're talking about these 10 years specifically. And the first of them debuts in Top Notch Comics #9. By this point, it's October of 1940. We're still a year away from the war. Keep that in mind.
Right.
We're still, as a country, we've not gotten into the war, so this is still just adventure stories. But in Top Notch number 9, they introduce arguably the second most famous MLJ character after the Shield, and that is the Black Hood.
Ah, yes.
And the Black Hood, as you guys can see, and as we'll show you guys on the website, you get the drill. All this will be on the website. It's a black face mask, but it doesn't cover his whole face. The bottom portion of his face is exposed. Black gloves, black boots, of course, black trunks, because if you're a superhero at that time, you got to have your trunks on.
Yeah.
And then yellow tights, a yellow shirt, and yellow leggings. I'm not sure why he goes for the black and yellow. It's never explained.
Not a very menacing color scheme.
No.
As a matter of fact, at the image that we're looking at right now, if you add black shoulder pads, it looks exactly like Yellow Jacket.
Oh, it does. Very much so. Yeah, I never put that together. From the early Marvel Yellow Jacket.
From the early
stuff.
Marvel stuff, yeah.
Yeah, you're right, it does.
Put some whiskers on him, and you got another Marvel character.
Well, I mean, yeah, make more the head mask yellow instead of black, and it could also go for a watered-down version of Wolverine's costume.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking of when I first
Very
saw it.
much. Which is very ironic because in later iterations of the character, later relaunches after the MLJ stuff ended, he does become quite a bit more of the anti-hero like that. But in this early stuff, he's still very pure and innocent and altruistic. And it was interesting. He's another one who I always knew the story of and have read a lot of Black Hood comics from various different relaunches. But until this last week or so, I had never actually read the origin. I knew it, but I'd never read it. It is one of the better books from MLJ from that era. It's still very much a 40s book. It's still very much a Golden Age book. There are things that do not make sense. But overall, this is your classic cop who is framed and wronged. Mm-hmm. He is kicked out of the force, and then he's beaten to a pulp and left in the woods for dead.
Oh, wow.
Sounds like typical 40s. Okay.
Right, yeah, exactly.
That's how you get rid of a problem.
You just dump him in the woods, yeah. While in the woods, a hermit finds him.
Okay.
Because
They
that's,
wander
you know,
randomly in
That's
the
what they
40s.
do.
that's what they do. In the 40s, hermits live in the woods, Yeah, this hermit finds him and takes him back to his shack in the woods.
Creepy.
Would one say it could be a funky little shack?
A funky little shack. He doesn't try to go all the way with the Black Hood.
I love running gags.
But he kind of helps him. He nurses him back to health. It never says why. It never says that he has any kind of connection. He just finds this guy, and out of the goodness of his heart, he's going to take care of it.
That's what
Okay.
hermits do. They wander around looking for people beaten up, nurse them back
And
to health.
nurse
Maybe,
them to
maybe
health,
this won't be
yeah.
the hero I've always wanted. Oh, he is. Yay.
And
Ironically,
he was.
And
Side,
right, see, that's what I'm
side
saying.
note,
That's
too,
true.
I've read a few other Golden Age Black Hood stories in this last week. Not once, at least any of the stuff that I've read, not once do they ever give the hermit a name.
Of course not. He's just the hermit.
And the Black Hood continues to refer to him as Hermit. At one point, the hermit leaves and leaves him a note on the table in the shack and signs it Hermit. So
Wow.
his name is Hermit, I guess. Anyway, this police officer's name is Matthew Kip Burland. And so this hermit nurses him back to health and revives him, and he explains that he was framed by a villain known as the Skull. Now, I'm not sure if this character predates Red Skull or not. I haven't been able to find anything conclusive on that, but he looks like the Red Skull, only with a green skull.
Oh.
And a little bit more robes as opposed to, the military outfit that Red Skull wears. So yes, this character is the character that has framed him. For some reason, and again, it never explains why, the Skull has somehow wronged the Hermit.
He's taken his name.
Yeah. And so they vow together that Matthew Burland will train and get himself ready and go after the Skull and bring the Skull to justice and clear his name in the process.
With his elderly sidekick, the
The
Hermit.
Hermit. Yeah. I mean,
I'd read it.
as far as a 40s origin story, it goes on for, I'd say, maybe 10 or 12 pages. It's very in-depth. There's a masquerade ball that the Skull ends up going to, and the Black Hood fights him there, and the Skull is also one of the very, very few villains in all of the Mighty Crusaders incarnations over the years to be reused.
Oh, okay.
And he was a recurring villain for the Black Hood quite often. In fact, I recently, these last few days, read a story where it was the final confrontation between the Black Hood and the Skull.
Oh.
And it was very, very, very cool story. You could tell that this is his Lex Luthor, this is his Joker, this is his Doctor Doom. It's a great story. I don't want to go into any detail on it because it is available. Everybody should go out and check it out for themselves, but we'll show you how, or tell you how to get that later on. It's really a good story, especially for the 40s. One of the other major characters that needs to be talked about from that era is Mr. Justice. Now, Mr. Justice premieres in Blue Ribbon number 9. Now, Mr. Justice is basically a ripoff of the Spectre. Now, the Spectre did,
okay.
The Spectre did come first, so I don't know if they were consciously ripping off the Spectre or if they just happened to create something that's exactly the same. But
Well, I mean, really, when you examine older even modern comics too,
they're
always
everybody is borrowing.
it's
from
it's
everybody
nothing
else.
new.
So,
Everybody
yeah.
complains about how Marvel and DC steal from each other nowadays. Man, they've been doing that for 80 years.
Right? Yeah. Get over it.
Right. Mr. Justice I bring up only because he will become important as we get into future iterations of the characters in future episodes of this miniseries. But he doesn't have a whole lot of importance at this point. At this point, he's really just a ghost.
Okay.
At this stage, he's Spectre watered down or Dead Man with the powers of the Spectre, depending on how you want to look at it. He is a prince from the 11th century who who is wrongfully murdered by his subjects and buried in his castle. His castle is then removed stone by stone in the late 30s, early 40s, and moved over to America.
Wait a minute. I've heard that. Is this the plot to Gargoyles?
That's right. That's what I was thinking.
It is very similar, isn't it? And, of course, there are always rumors that there's a ghost of the old prince that has haunted that castle, but
Right. He's
stuck in the castle, and so even if you see him, it's no big deal. Well, as they're moving the castle across the ocean, the ship hits something or it
Iceberg.
I don't know what happens, but the ship sinks. It didn't really go into detail when I was reading the thing. It just said suddenly the ship sinks, and therefore,
Ruh-roh.
ruh-roh. And the castle then sinks to the bottom of the ocean, which frees him. Now I don't know why that frees him and why taking the castle apart prior to that didn't
Personally
free him.
speaking, I think I would
But-
have rather read the Aquatic Adventures.
Yeah. Like he's stuck
Of this-
underwater,
of
an
this
underwater ghost.
water ghost.
Yeah,
Water
that would be
specter.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, he's
I'm haunting fish.
he's a ghost, and he ends up going back to America because that's where the ship was headed. Why didn't he just go back home? I don't know. But he goes back to America, and for whatever reason, he is able to solidify his body, almost Vision style, almost like how Vision can change the density of his body.
Right, yeah.
He basically can do the same thing and creates a body for himself to inhabit so that he can interact with people in the 20th century, in 1940s.
Okay, well, I know that's not how ghosts work. I watched the Patrick Swayze movie.
And that's, yeah. Well, and then he can leave this body that he has created
So he's
as
created
an empty
a body.
husk.
So it's like a golem. It's like an
It
empty.
is.
an
It is
empty
almost
husk
like a golem. That's
that he-
really, I didn't even think of that. Yeah.
He'll jump into so that he can move around and interact with people, but then jump out of it and nobody can see him when he's in ghost form.
Correct.
Just like Dead Man.
Just like Dead
Just
Man.
like Dead
right.
Man. All right.
But he has all these connections to this larger mystical, magical world the way Spectre does that is never really fully explained other than the fact that he's a ghost. Again, his stuff is not that important at this time. He's around for a while. He's certainly one of the main characters at MLJ, but he becomes far more important in later iterations. So I bring him up now because he is kind of an important character down the line.
I look forward to finding out more about the ghostly Mr. Justice.
Mr. Justice. Probably the final major character from that era is a character known as the Hangman. And the Hangman,
One of my personal favorites.
Yeah. The Hangman has probably the most interesting story across all the relaunches.
Yeah.
But for these 10 years, the Hangman starts out as a man named Robert Dickering, who is John Dickering's younger brother. And John Dickering was the Comet.
Dun, dun, dun!
It's all connected.
How about that? Robert comes to visit the Comet, who, by this time, by the way, the Comet ends up becoming the first misunderstood superhero.
So before Spider-Man.
Before Spider-Man, yeah.
There was the Comet.
He is mind-controlled in, I forget what issue of Pep, very early on in Pep Comics. He is mind-controlled and framed. He ends up becoming wanted. He becomes public enemy number 1, essentially.
Oh, wow, okay.
For almost the entire majority of the rest of his time in the golden age of comics. He is wanted wrongfully, and he's constantly trying to clear his name. The only person who knows that he's the Comet is his girlfriend, who I want to say her name was Thelma. I can't remember what her last name was, but I'm pretty sure he called her Thel. So finally, in Pep Comics number 17, this is July of 1941, again, still not at the war yet,
Right.
the Hangman, Robert Dickering, ends up visiting his brother, John. He comes home from college to visit his brother and catches his brother in the middle of changing out of his Comet costume.
Oh. Awkward.
Awkward. So now all three, they all know, and they kind of hang out together. Bob Dickering starts to hang out with John's girlfriend. It gets a little bizarre. Yeah, there's some undertones when you read the story that's like, okay, was there maybe some swapping going on or something here? I'm not sure. Yeah, Bob ends up getting kidnapped by criminals, because it's all criminals. Other than the Skull, there's very few supervillains.
Right, yeah.
At
It's
this
just
time.
criminals, just bad guys.
What,
not
Skull,
supervillains.
Skull, Joker, and Lex Luthor, I think, that might be it for supervillains. Anyway, Bob gets kidnapped by criminals, and Comet, of course, rushes to his aid, but is shot.
Oh.
I believe multiple times, if I remember correctly.
Riddled with bullets.
By these criminals. And dies.
Holy,
the Comet
okay.
dies in Pep Comics number 17. He's the first superhero to die in a comic book, ever.
Now, see, that's history.
His brother Bob, who is completely distraught by this, vows vengeance.
He won't be distraught after he hooks up with Thelma a couple more
Which
times.
he does. Because John tells him to on his deathbed.
Go ahead, you can have my girlfriend now.
He does.
Wow.
He says, you guys need to be together. It will be an honor to me, or something like that.
Treat her as tenderly as I have. She really likes it when you nibble her ear.
Right. He's giving her pointers.
Tickled behind the ear. Write that down.
So, so he decides that he's going to enact his own justice. He becomes the Hangman. There's no special abilities to him. There's no powers. He stalks criminals at night. And he
chokes them.
He projects, much like Spider-Man does with his spider belt, he projects the image, the silhouette of a gallows on a wall. And when you see that, you know the Hangman's coming for you.
Just like if you saw, the shadow of a bat, you knew the Batman was coming for you.
Yeah, right.
I love these similarities.
The Black Hood and the Shield and the Wizard, not as much. But these other characters, all these other guys, they're brutal. They do not hold back. The Comet, he drops a guy from 70, 80 feet in the air who, in his very first issue, he captures a criminal.
To his death?
Yeah, to his death. He says, let me go. I don't, and so he does. Yeah.
Wow. Well, let's not forget, when Batman shows up, Batman was pretty brutal, too.
So was Superman.
Right. They were all brutal. It wasn't like they were not using kid gloves. So it's good to know that the MLJ characters followed the same code of violence.
Especially the Comet and the Hangman. There's something about the Dickering brothers. Those two got an anger streak in them.
They got a screw loose. They like pain.
Yeah. The other one that is equally as brutal, and he becomes kind of a bigger character later, is the Web. He debuts much later in 1942 in Zip Comics number 27, and I think he's a professor who decides to fight crime and right wrongs and catch the underbelly criminals in his web of deceit.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. I just read his first appearance and this last week as well, and he threw an axe into somebody's head. Wow. And threw a barrel at someone and crushed them. And it's like, what? Wow, these guys did not pull any punches back then. And it was right in the middle of his head. I mean, it's an axe.
It kind of
was
reminds
crazy.
me.
They were learning curves, guys.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Zack
'Cause they were
Snyder
new.
was right, I guess.
They were new, and they didn't know.
Well, think about it. A modern, I guess you could call it a superhero-ish kind of tale, but one of James Gunn's films, Super, about an ordinary man who's been pushed too far and decides to go out and fight crime. He has no powers whatsoever.
He's a wrench.
He's just he has a wrench, but he is a masked hero, not a superhero, and he was violent.
Yeah.
Extremely violent. And I wonder if James Gunn, in writing that script, did that specifically because the Golden Age heroes were more violent
It's
than their
possible.
Silver Age and Modern Age counterparts.
It's possible. He would be someone that would get into that stuff. I
Oh,
would
yeah, 'cause
think.
he loves
I
comic
think,
books, just like
and
us,
I would
yeah.
think he would love that era and the kitschiness now
Yeah,
that the
yeah.
Golden Age has.
Something to ponder,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. And those are kind of your big again, like I said, there are many other heroes that they introduced during that time, but those were really kind of the big ones. And these comics, these characters ran for almost 10 years. I mean, they ran up until sometime in the late 40s. They even spun off into their own comics. Shield and Wizard, much like World's Finest, got their own comic, the Shield Wizard comics.
So they were together, like teamed up?
It was two different stories. So it was a Shield story and a Wizard story. But it was very similar to those early World's Finest, where you got a Superman story and a
Batman story. Right.
And then there was Jackpot Comics, which I think featured 4 or 5 of the superheroes, I think. I mean, the superheroes took over MLJ Comics.
Right.
Gone was Rangatang. Gone was Calthar, the Tarzan-like guy who could grow really big. You know, gone were the detectives and the cowboys, and the superheroes really took over. So much so, in fact, that in July of 1943, the Black Hood made the transition from comics to media
Oh, okay.
and got his own radio drama in the 40s. Now, it only lasted for, I want to say, about 6 to 8 months, something like that.
Oh, okay.
And it no longer exists. I think there is one episode that still exists. It is on YouTube. We'll have it, like everything else, on the website and in the show notes. But it's a little hard to hear. You can tell that the recording is not cleaned and it hasn't been cared for over the years.
Yeah.
It's one random episode of the Black Hood. But it does still exist. You can listen to it on YouTube. To this day, he is still the only character from the entire Mighty Crusaders pantheon to make the transition from comics to media of any format.
Wow. You would think, for as influential as these characters are for comic book history, you would think that something would have happened.
I'm sure that the studios developed a Shield movie serial. I would gotta think that after the success of the Captain America movie serial, that they would do one on the Shield, that they would plot one anyway. I guess it just never came to fruition. None of that really even matters, though, because in Pep Comics number 22, in December of 1941, that month of infamy, MLJ introduced a teenage brat by the name of Archie Andrews as a backup story in Pep Comics.
Oh.
And it took off.
It starts.
All the people that were reading these superheroes, they're all now fighting overseas. Archie has now been introduced. Who's left behind? Teenagers and kids. The teenager boom is about to hit in 10 years, in the early 50s.
Yeah.
So this is the prelude to that. And Archie and Betty and Veronica and Jughead and all those guys, they slowly start to take over. One by one, MLJ Comics starts to retire all of the superheroes until you get to 1946. By 1946, about the only two that are left are the Black Hood and the Shield. And the Black Hood by then had been given his own book, Black Hood Comics.
Yeah.
But then in June of 46, Black Hood Comics ends. So the Shield is it. Now the Shield lasted now as a backup story to Archie. Now Archie was taking the forefront.
How the tide has turned.
Yes. Shield lasts for another few years until Pep Comics number 65 in 1948, when MLJ retires the Shield. It's around there that they changed the name to Archie Comics. It's not long after, I believe. And that's it. That is the end of the MLJ run.
Wow.
Like so many other things. DC Comics did the same thing. The Flash had been retired. The Justice Society had been retired.
Yeah.
Captain America vanished from comic shelves. I mean, if you weren't Superman, Batman, or Wonder Woman, chances are you weren't published anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same way here. You know, they all went away. It's just these characters just couldn't sustain the way Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman could.
Yeah.
They just never could. And that's where we ask you guys, what was your introduction to the heroes that made up the MLJ roster? Was it these early 1940s Golden Age heroes, or was it later? Reach out to us at our website at mybigfatpolis.com and share your history with these iconic characters. The MLJ Influence. So we've touched upon this a little bit already, the influence that these characters had. And obviously some of it is pretty obvious to you guys, I think.
Right.
You know, the Shield being the most obvious, of course, but the Comet as well, being the first hero to die in comics.
Well, that's a big thing, because you don't want to kill off. Back then, you wouldn't even think about killing off a character.
Stayed dead.
Yeah.
And stay dead, yeah.
Well, he does. Now, you know, everybody check out our next episode, the first revival of the characters, where we'll get into how he is brought back. But that's another thing altogether. yeah, it's at that time that's a pretty ballsy move.
Well, right, yeah.
For, you know, that era. But there are other things too that are influential. Everybody knows that Captain America had a triangular shield, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, yeah.
At the beginning.
In the beginning.
He always had that before he switched over to the round shield.
Yeah, the circular one, right.
He switched to the round shield because of MLJ Comics.
Oh.
The triangular shield, we will find the exact image here, guys, to show you on the website so that you can see what I'm showing to Mr. X and Smurfy here. But the Shield's original costume basically is the triangular shield.
It's exactly like Captain America's original shield.
It is exactly like his shield. And when Captain America came out, MLJ said, no, that's too close to our character. That's a ripoff. What I did not know is they changed it in the very next issue. I did not know that the round shield came in Captain America Comics number 2. Mm-hmm. That was new news to me. But they switched it because MLJ threatened to sue over the shield. So that's pretty influential, too.
Imagine a world, a reality, in which MLJ never threatened to sue, and Captain America still has a triangular shield.
We probably never would have gotten the round shield until years later when a writer says, let's do something different.
Let's
Right.
round it.
Yeah.
The round shield, you can use like a frisbee,
Yeah, it's iconic.
a boomerang,
Yeah.
a sled. The triangular one, you really can't. It's not going to come back to you.
No.
The physics, the comic book
You can't
physics.
bounce off the wall and catch it again.
Exactly. There's too
That's
many
known for it.
There's too many pointy edges.
Yeah.
Stick it in somebody.
You
Done.
Well, I guess unless you have
could.
like a magnetized, device of some sort, I guess, on your
Mainly stabbins.
Yeah.
That's what it's good for. Stabbins.
Yeah.
Stabbins and
Stabbins.
blockins.
shoveling.
Walking and stabbing.
You could use it to shovel.
Or that.
Yeah. Dig. Yeah, they have a couple of other influential things too. They had a character called the Firefly, who debuted in Top Notch number 8, and Firefly, his origin is probably the easiest origin of any superhero ever.
Bitten by a radioactive firefly?
Oh,
No.
that'd be awesome.
But he grew up from a kid always wanting to be a crime fighter, so he trained himself. And then when he perfected the right kind of potion that he needed to take, it made him glow in the dark. And he thought, well, I'm as strong as many insects, and I can project this light in the dark, and what do I call myself? And he happened to be standing in a field of fireflies, and he calls himself the Firefly. It's like the easiest origin.
Thank God he wasn't born like the 80s. I am light bright.
Yeah, light bright.
You're just looking at things
at my
that are
color-
around the room.
my-
It's like, oh, look at this microphone. I will be Mike Man.
I am lamp.
I am Lamp.
I am lamp.
Yeah.
But the influential thing of him is, while he's not the first, I think he's one of the first 5 insect-themed superheroes of all time. Now, there were I think Timely Comics had a Black Widow back then, long before Natasha Romanoff, and I want to say that there was someone called like the Red Bee or something like that at that time. I'm not sure, but
scary.
The impact, if you will, of Firefly is that he is one of the first insect-themed superheroes. Not the first, but he is early.
I don't even know if that counts, though, because just because he can glow in the dark and he has the proportionate strength of a firefly,
yeah.
we're going to go with that? Is that
Evidently.
Okay.
Evidently. You wonder why that one never took off, huh?
Why not glowworm?
Right.
Glow.
Exactly.
I'm just saying.
There's your 80s team up right there, Smurfy.
Firefly
Glowworm and
and
Lightbright.
Right.
Lightbright. Write that shit.
Yeah, we should put that out. That's our next book.
We shine down justice on crime. That's right.
You know, I mentioned too that Inferno started out as a villain. I cannot find any information to back this up. So, just to make it very clear now, this is my own assumption based on what I've been able to find, but I believe that Inferno might be the first villain to become a hero in comics.
Okay.
Now, again, there might be another one out there that I don't know of that I haven't read, and if any of our listeners out there do know of them, please let us know.
Yeah, share.
Share that information. As far as I'm aware, Inferno is the first, and he's very cool. He comes back a lot in a lot of iterations over the years, sometimes as a villain, even. So
far, MLJ Comics has gotten the first patriotic superhero.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We've got the first superhero that was misunderstood, framed, and always trying to clear their name.
Yep.
First superhero to die.
Yep.
And quite possibly the first villain to turn hero.
Yeah. And
The first guy to shoot stuff out of their eyes, too.
oh yeah.
Oh, well,
Don't forget about him.
shooting
Right.
out of that. Yep.
And there's another one. There's a big one that is, let's say, debatable.
Okay, all right.
This is probably the most shocking piece of news that I came across recently in putting all this information together. In Top Notch Comics number 5. Now, Top Notch was the Wizards book.
Okay.
In that book, it's I believe the story is something like the Muscanian murders or something like that. The title of the story is. It's part 1. In that book, he goes to the FBI for help, and they put him in touch with their number 1 G-man, the Shield.
Oh.
The Shield and the Wizard meet for the very first time in Top Notch Comics number 5. Now, Top Notch Comics number 5 has a cover date of May 1940.
Okay.
Most comic book scholars will tell you, and up until recently I would have agreed with all of them, that Marvel Mystery Comics number 8 is the first crossover and first essentially shared universe in comics, when the Human Torch met Submariner.
Okay, yeah, right.
Now, that has a cover date of June 1940, a month later than this. However, there are people that claim that Marvel Comics number 8 came out in April, even though its cover date is June, and there are others who claim that because of some sort of publishing issue, it didn't come out until 3 or 4 months later. Now, I have not been able to find a definitive answer on it, but depending on which answer is correct, could mean that the MLJ characters are the very first shared universe in comics. Possibly. If not the very first, tied with Marvel.
Wow.
And no one knows. I didn't know that, and I'm obsessed with these characters.
Well, sadly, almost everybody's probably dead.
From the era? Yeah,
From the era,
probably
I mean,
anybody that could actually answer it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Unfortunately. But it's cool that even if they aren't the first, they're tied as the first.
Which is still...
with Marvel Comics.
Which is still a huge momentous moment. I mean, that Top Notch Comics number 5 absolutely comes out a few months prior to World's Fair Comics, what is that, number 2 or whatever, where Superman and Batman appear on the cover together.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So it definitely beats Superman and Batman.
Right.
And depending on which story is accurate, possibly beats Namor and the Human Torch. And they, of course, go on to be, like Superman and Batman, very good friends, and so much so that they get their own book, Shield Wizard Comics. But
Shield Wizard.
yeah, Shield Wizard, that could be a whole
That
character.
right? No, that's a whole character right there. Hello, I am Shield Wizard.
Sounds like a wax you put on your car. Get the Shield Wizard. Protect against all grime and goo.
Use it with this ShamWow.
Right.
There's one final, I wouldn't necessarily say it's influential, but the very first sidekick, superhero sidekick in comics, we all know is Robin.
The Boy Wonder.
The Boy Wonder. But the Shield got himself a sidekick, too. Everybody back then had a sidekick. I think Green Arrow debuted with Speedy. I mean, everybody had a sidekick, but the Shield had a sidekick, too. Dusty, the Boy Detective. Yeah. Who?
Oh, God bless the 40s.
Who was a detective who was orphaned, and Shield took him in as his ward. So they weren't.
Was he an orphan in the Dust Bowl?
Yeah.
Right.
But Dusty, the Boy Detective, came out 4 months before Bucky did.
Oh. So he doesn't beat Robin, but he does beat Bucky.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay. Way
And-
to go, Dusty, Bucky.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Where's Dusty now?
I think in future iterations, and I'll go ahead and say this now because we probably won't get into it in other episodes. I think in future iterations they say that he grew up or was somehow controlled by someone and dishonorably discharged from being a superhero or something to that effect. I'm not sure. Anyway, he ended up
Becoming a hermit?
No, he became right. He ended up becoming the director of some sort of like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. type of organization, I want to say, and then I think just retired and faded away. I don't think they did anything.
Lived
with
a
him
good
after that.
life, picket fence and all.
Yeah, but he did for a long time team up with the Wizard's sidekick, Roy the Superboy.
Oh my God, Roy and Dusty.
Roy the Superboy.
Roy the Superboy and Dusty the Boy Detective, and when they would get together, they were the boy buddies.
Was their catchphrase Jinkies? Oh, sorry, wrong cartoon.
So,
Golly gee, guys.
Okay, so if Roy was a Superboy, how super was he? I mean, you laugh, but I really want to know. I mean, was he super?
He was just a very good
The
boy.
way that the Wizard was super, he had a mighty brain and he knew prestidigitation.
Well, there are many resources that you can use to find out about Roy the Superboy and Dusty the Boy Detective and the boy buddies and everything. But we'll get into that here in just a second. Now it is time for our retrospective review of the MLJ years. So at this point, because I've reread so many of these books in preparation for this miniseries event that we're doing, I do want to take a little bit of time just to give you guys a review of how the books read.
Okay.
Especially now being so far removed. But before I get to that, to kind of get into what you were saying about how do we find out about who the Roy Superboy is and what his deal is and how you even read this stuff, there are a couple of different outlets to get them. They're very, very, very difficult to find at comic conventions. Obviously, anything from the Golden Age is going to be tough to find.
Yeah.
And anything from the Golden Age is going to be pricey unless the cover is gone. And even then, sometimes it can be pricey. So buying them, unless you're independently wealthy, is probably out of the question. Outside of that, there is a wonderful, wonderful resource online run by a man named Rick Offenberger called the Mighty Crusaders Network, and it is mightycrusaders.net. We will put a link on the website and in the show notes for you all. That is the one-stop spot for anything Mighty Crusaders, from any era, from any version. It has who's, it has bios, and now they have started putting up complete full scans of the Golden Age books.
Oh, wow, okay.
Not everything. There's a lot of stuff that obviously is not there.
Right.
But there are a ton of classic Golden Age MLJ books that I've always known about and never been able to read until recently. So anybody that wants to read that stuff, go to mightycrusaders.net and go to the galleries button. They're all under the galleries, and you can check them all out there. The other way to read any of this Golden Age stuff, there was a trade paperback from about 10 years ago, around 2005-ish, well, I guess that's probably more 15 years ago now, isn't it?
Yeah.
That reprints the first 4 issues of Pep Comics, and I want to say it's the first 2 or 3 issues of Shield Wizard Comics, but it only reprints the Shield stories.
Oh, okay.
It is called America's First Patriotic Comic Book Hero, The Shield, and it is published by Archie Comics. Unfortunately, you do not get the Wizard stories from the Shield Wizard Comics in this, but you do get issues 4. Oh, and actually, now that I think about it, I think issue 5 of Pep Comics, which eerily is a story about the Shield trying to stop some other made-up fake terrorist group from attacking and destroying Pearl Harbor to start a war. And that came out 5-6 months before Pearl Harbor actually occurred.
Oh, wow.
So that's a little creepy and eerie, and you can read that story in that graphic novel. It's very, very good. The Shield stories in particular read pretty easily for a book from the 40s. The other 2 outlets that you have, there's another book also by Rick Offenberger. Rick Offenberger, by the way, is kind of the leading authority on these characters. His wealth of knowledge for these characters is what I aspire to have. But he put out a book a number of years ago called the MLJ Companion, and that breaks down the complete history from the beginnings in 1939 all the way up to the current stuff. And he starts the book off with reprints of about 4 or 5 classic things. I think the first appearance of the Web is in there, and the first appearance of Steel Sterling, and so on and so forth. So that's a book that can be gotten, anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. You can check those stories out. The final place that you can read things is a group on Facebook called the Shield G-Man Club. You can go to the Shield G-Man Club, join the group. They have an insane amount of scans on there.
Yeah.
Scans that are not on the Mighty Crusaders network. Much of the Pep Comics stuff is on there, and they are scans in their entirety.
Okay.
You get all the other
Nice.
small stories. So you just kind of have to sift through it, and every so often they'll put out a few more issues or half of an issue or whatever, and just keep updating it. But so those are kind of your outlets as far as reading them, which is great because I don't own originals. At least I don't own any of them pre-1960. That was a great way for me as a hardcore longtime fan to actually be able to read them. Most of them are pretty creaky.
Yeah.
Most of them are your typical 40s Golden Age stuff. The Shield stuff is good. The Black Hood stuff is really quite good. Let's see. The Comet stuff is crazy and fun. It can be a little 40s tedious at times. But overall, it's fairly consistent. It doesn't ever get to a point where, with some runs in the last 30, 40 years of other books that we've all talked about, where it loses steam after 20 issues or something.
Yeah.
They never really quite do that. Maybe a little bit here and there, but for the most part, if you're okay with reading Golden Age comics, which are a totally different approach to comic book storytelling, they're pretty good. Especially, like I said, the Shield and the Black Hood. And Bob Phantom, actually, the few stories of the Bob Phantom that I read are really good. They just don't really ever explain anything.
But he's a mystery.
But the book itself, the stories are really, actually pretty good. So yeah, overall, I don't know if I would want to give it an actual rating, but overall, I would say that they're worth checking out. They're worth looking into. And anyone that's interested, the first Shield story and the first Black Hood story are absolutely worth reading. There's the first 10 years of MLJ. Now, as we said in the beginning, Mr. X, you had a passing interest and a passing knowledge of these characters.
And it's growing every day.
It's growing. Smurfy, this is your first experience. So, after this, what's your initial thoughts? I'm curious.
I actually want to know more. Yeah, I'm kind of hooked.
Well,
Dear Lord.
for Smurfy, we have brought him the Mighty Crusaders starter kit, as I like to call it. As I said before, we will have different guest hosts throughout this miniseries, but our 5th and final episode of the miniseries, Mr. X and Smurfy and I will reunite to bring this to a close. And at that point in time, Smurfy, you can read through this starter kit. What I'm giving you here is the first, either the first 4 or 5 issues of all of the major runs, or the best, what I consider the best stuff of the major runs, including the Mighty Comics era, which will be our next episode, the Red Circle and Archie Adventure run, the Impact Comics, the DC Red Circle comics, when DC licensed them. Gosh, what was that? Right after Final Crisis, I think, maybe?
I remember seeing those.
Yeah, and tried to integrate them into DC continuity. The New Crusaders comics, when Archie got them back. And the most current stuff, Dark Circle. So,
Got a little bit of everything.
When we get back together, we'll see what you think and see how you feel about each version, which ones you care to learn more about, or if you don't care to learn about any of them. So that'll be on our 5th episode. Well, that's it, guys. That's the first part of the Mighty Crusaders. I want to thank everybody for listening to episode 1 of 5, and join us for part 2, where we will cover the very first revival of the MLJ characters with the Archie Adventure series and Mighty Comics in the 60s, and explore how their continued influence shaped modern comics as we know them. I'm Dr. Impact.
I'm Smurfy.
And I'm the mysterious Mr. X.
So until our next crusade, stay mighty, friends.
We have reached the end of this verbal adventure, but there will be more. Be sure to bag and board the knowledge you have been given in the long boxes of your mind, safe from the dust bunnies of memory. Visit mybigfatpollist.com for all of their 4-color content and follow their social media pages to stay informed. And remember, the secrets of the universe are between the panels.
Thank you for letting us come inside you and fill you with knowledge.
Right, yeah, we're not going to use
We're
that.
going to do that one.
Because then I was
We're the boy
Because then I was going to go,
buddies.
because we're going all the way with the MLJ. That's how it's going to end.
I had one earlier.
Told you it was great, but not great.
It's too sexual.
Is it really? Do you think?
It's too hot.
Just way too sexual.
It's too hot.
Sure.
Smurfy just making noise over here,
Yep.
not knowing what's going on, as usual.
Remember, once we actually start the episode, you have to stop putting your hand
Oh, no.
in the plastic bag. That
I don't know what you're
makes
talking
noise.
about. What?
Actually, through the entire episode.
Okay, guys.
sprinkled.
I eventually was just going to put my whole hand in and be like,
Just do a little.
Oh, excuse me.
You have so many dice
Real
I could put in
slow.
here? Put some dice in this bag? Like, Yahtzee. What was the thing? Oh, I had those
Steve.
peach rings, and I was slowly going for one. He was just giving me death stares, and he's like, just get the damn ring.
Wait a minute. Open your damn
I
drink.
was just gonna say.
There's no noise.
Take a drink. Close the bottle. Swallow.
I'm good. I said I realized my throat was getting dry. Too many Twizzlers. I was
That's
like,
why I
uh-oh.
had the one. Yeah, you go.
Now I'm good now.
Okay.
That's terrific.
All right.
Take your hand out of that damn bag.
I couldn't even hear it.
I heard it.
I'm good now. Thank you.